Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of a suitable agency to a wonderful new session of Suitable Conversations at Sunder Nursery. This series of conversations was first inspired by our love for all things books, and a suitable agency is extremely grateful to everyone at Sunder Nursery for their support. And now, for the event we've been waiting for, the Pleasures of Solitude with two very special speakers, Jeet Thayil and Nilanjana Roy. Jeet Thayil is a poet, novelist, librettist, and musician. As a boy, he traveled through much of the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia with his father, T.J.S, a writer and editor. He worked as a journalist for 21 years in Bombay, Bangalore, Hong Kong, and New York City. In 2005, he began writing fiction. The first installment of his Bombay Trilogy, the best-selling Narcopolis, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and won the DSC Prize. His book of poems, These Errors Are Correct, won the Sahitya Akademi Award, and his musical collaborations include the opera Babur in London. His essays, poetry, and short fiction have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Granta, T.L.S, Esquire, the London Magazine, the Times, the Guardian, and the Paris Review, among other venues. He is the editor of the Penguin Book of Indian Poets. Jeet Thayil's latest collection of poetry is I'll Have It Here, and his new novel, Melanin, is forthcoming. Nilanjana Roy is the author of 3 novels, including the acclaimed Black River, and has edited 3 anthologies, including Our Freedoms. She is also a columnist for the Financial Times and writes on books and reading. Thank you both for being a part of Suitable Conversations. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. My first time at Sunder Nursery, and it really will not be the last. Really good to see some old Delhi friends. Reminds me why I miss this town. Anyway, let's begin. A little crash course in the uses and pleasures of solitude.
I'm kind of glad that everyone's here, though you all seem very far away, so if anyone wants to shift to the cushions, come on way over. And I'm happy to welcome Jeet back to the city where in some ways it feels like he never left. You know, even though Bangalore has a claim on him. And the pleasures of solitude when you're a writer like Jeet. Nightclubs, bars, bookshops, parties, literary festivals, speakeasies, Shuklaji Street, opium dens, mean streets, easy streets, beaches, boutiques, music stages, salons, pubs, clubs, promenades. Those are some of the places where your fans are used to seeing you.
I thought you didn't do any background homework for this talk.
I didn't. I was just having fun with, you know, words and stuff. But at the same time, I think anyone who's known you for a while also knows about the hermit side. And that's pretty serious. You know, that's the side where you retreat, and that's where the novels, the books of poetry, the anthologies, that's where a lot of the work gets done, except that it isn't a work so much as it is a life, a way of living. And how do you balance these two? Do you feel the need for a balance, and which self do you think is more real? The one that's out there, visible, that everyone knows, and then there's the self that's not necessarily a quieter, you know, but it is the private self, the solitary self, the one that takes pleasure in solitude.
There was that question reminds me. A flash came into my mind of a scene from a movie called All That Jazz by Bob Fosse. I don't know if anyone here has seen it. About a choreographer based on Bob Fosse, who begins each day with a bunch of amphetamines in his bathroom from his medicine cabinet, takes a bunch of pills, shuts the mirrored door to the cabinet, looks at himself, at his reflection, and says, "It's showtime, folks." I think that's, you know, writers will recognize that scene. Artists, people who work alone will recognize that scene, because what we do, the real us, we sit alone in a room for hours on end and we don't notice time passing. Time dissolves. because that kind of solitude, it's not just necessary and essential for the kind of work that a book involves. It's also self-perpetuating and addictive. You do that for a few hours a day, every day, for years on end, and if you don't get a few hours on your own every day to recharge, to think things through, it's a bad day. You feel incomplete. And the other side of us, that other face that says, that is here, for example, that's the face that says, it's showtime, folks. But at least in my head, there's a very definite divide between those two beings. And I think, you need both when you produce art. You need to then explain it, maybe.
That swing, that business of going out into the world and then coming back, but into a deeper world, we're going to get into that. But could we start with a short reading? How to Be Alone. For those of you who are just joining us, don't worry, we've only just started the conversation. The chairs up here, make yourself comfortable. There's cushions out here if you want to be even more comfortable.
Join the brave people up in front, right here. This is from the new issue of Outlook magazine. They've got it's an issue, the theme is love and loneliness, and I did something called How to Be Alone. The title of this poem is Garbo-esque, because Greta Garbo once said, probably her best known line from the many movies she did was, I want to be alone. So this is a poem called Garbo-esque. I'm going to try and time it to the beat. Darling, I hear you talk of fragility, how we are loneliest when we're in touch with the 100,000 lonelinesses out there, wherever there may be. And I welcome the lack you speak of, the absence of human connection, and hesitate to call this momentary lapse of aloneness love, because it isn't. It's only flesh slapping against itself. What you call loneliness, I call pleasure, which, considering what you and I do for employment and for love, is the best part of our day. To be alone in a room, tapping away into the world, into the void, into the word, at one with one's addiction to solitude, as time dissolves, and we know how much better this is than to be with someone lost inside their few square inches of screen. How much better it is to be alone. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jeet. It's strange how much of a cultural prohibition there is to some extent against solitude. We expect it to be with family, we expect it to be productive, we expect it to be kind of out there every minute of our lives. And
reaffirmations from the world around us. That's the cry of solitude.
Yeah. I think he agrees, though he sounds as though he's had enough of it and he just wants a little company, But I wanted to start with childhood, which is often the place where we develop a taste for solitude, even in the middle of large families or even in the middle of, schools that were bustling and lively. You moved around a lot. And I was thinking of, I brought you this quote from Rilke, to be solitary as one was as a child, as the grown-ups were moving about, preoccupied with things that seemed big and important, because the grown-ups appeared so busy, and because you couldn't understand what they were doing. And when you were on your own as a child, did that make you feel lonely, or did that give you a sense of power?
I don't think I've ever felt loneliness as a child. In the same way that I've never felt boredom as a child. You only understand loneliness as a thing, or boredom as a thing, when you get older and when you are in situations with social situations that you don't really want to be in. That's when you feel loneliness and boredom. Neither of those things ever happened to me as a child, and I don't think it happens to children. When a child says they're bored, like the John Berryman poem, you know, I am heavy bored. When children say they're bored, it's a cry for attention. I don't think it's actual boredom as adults know boredom. You know, if you are surrounded by people who leave you lonely, you know.
I think we get that as well. There's nothing lonelier than a crowd, and sometimes for some people, there's nothing lonelier than being in a relationship that's supposed to. We put so much weight on the whole thing about love being the one thing that's going to fulfill you, or it's your children. You know, it's always supposed to come from a source that's somewhere outside of us. But let's take a step back into what solitude means for you as a writer. And of course, you know, some of us in Delhi have known Jeet for a long time, but I'm still astonished when I look at his body of work. 5 novels, from Narcopolis to Low to the soon-to-be-published Melanin. 5 collections of poetry, Gemini, Apocalypso, which was, you know, one of my early favorites. English, These Errors Are Correct, I'll have it here. 6 if you include the collected poems. A libretto, Babur in London. 3 anthologies, from Blood Axe to 60 Indian poets to Give the Sea Change and It Shall Change. And so part of the solitude that you spend as a writer is also spent in the company of other words, in the company of writers past and present. You know, so when did that start for you? Was that Hong Kong, Bombay? I should mention that Jeet's been part of many cities.
I grew up in Hong Kong, and I think I started to read seriously at about the age of 14, and the same time that I began to write. So, you know, I began to read, I began to write. I started to hear music in a different way. I started to write songs, and I did some very strange drawings, you know, at the age of about 14, and then by about 20 or so, you're socialized into correctitude, you know, into thinking, okay, this is not something I can do, this is something that I should learn how to do, and all of that stuff. And I think much later, you kind of unlearn those attitudes, at least I did, and I was able to go back. As we were saying, I think it's impossible really to produce with any kind of consistency unless you're very happy to be alone in a room and to be with yourself and to be sitting on the furniture in your head and to be reading the lines of the books in your head and to be hearing the voices of the dead in your head, you know, going back to the poets you read in your 20s and in your teens. In my case, they're all dead. But the voices of the dead peering and speaking from over your shoulder, looking at the things that you are, looking at the words that appear on your screen, it's the best possible school, I think, that you could go to, a writer's school or an artist's school. And without that, you couldn't produce the books you do, the books I do, and you certainly wouldn't produce with any kind of consistency. And I think, you know, once you get into that rhythm, a day without it is not really a day, you know. And I think it's not even a question of depression, which certainly in my case, if it's an empty day or if I'm unable to think or read or write, I open myself up to a kind of a black hole. Yeah, I think it's more than merely a black hole, you know.
I was thinking of the way it is often for women writers, because there's a long line out there somewhere echoing in my head. Ismat Chugtai, you know, writing on her charpai. I just love our backing band today. They're awesome. Give them, take a bow. But Ismat Chugtai, you know, writing on her charpai, in between the noise of the house. There was Shivani, who used to shut the door on the domestic world in order to write short stories. And so many women became short story writers because that was, or poets, because that was the kind of time that you had. You could work on things in a little flash. Or Maya Angelou, going off to a hotel room, where she didn't have to worry about, again, you shut out the household. You shut out all the people who you love, who have a claim on your time. And what I wanted to get at with this is that the self you speak of is a self that only evolves in aloneness. And maybe now this is a good time because, there's a lot of confusion over what solitude is. It's confused with being lonely. It's confused with being solitary. And would you say that we are talking about something that's separate from both states?
For sure. Aloneness and solitude are desirable states, really. It's what Maya Angelou was looking for in that hotel room. It's what George Simenon used to look for. He did the same thing. He lived in Paris, but he would check into a hotel in Paris, and usually a good hotel because his books made money. The Maigret detective stories, they made money, so he could check into a good hotel. He would check into a hotel for 6 weeks and come out with a novel. And which is why he wrote something like 500 books in his lifetime. So what he was paying for those 6 weeks was the great privilege and pleasure of being alone in a nice room in a decent hotel. To not be at the mercy of every doorbell, every phone call, every household demand. Exactly what Maya Angelou was doing as well. I think, that's a lesson we could all take away. Maybe the thing to do is to check into hotels and leave your phone off,
Yeah, if you can afford it, which comes to the other side of it.
There are cheap hotels as well.
Yeah. A lot of your early the time that you spent as a writer was spent also wandering around cities, sometimes in the company of many people, sometimes in the company of strangers or lovers or friends, but sometimes again just on your own. And two of the places where you traditionally find yourself in solitude, one I think is more mine than yours, which is the forests and the wilderness, and that is or isn't your landscape, your terrain.
It's certainly urban.
Yeah. But cities, again, how does a place like New York or London or Bombay or Bangalore or Delhi change when, even if you're in a partnership or even if, you're participating in the social life, the community life, how do these places change when you just go out on your own as a writer, not necessarily in search of material, just somebody who wants to rub up against the city a bit?
I think the reason cities are addictive in a way, much as solitude is because when you go out alone into a city, like Delhi especially, Bombay, New York, Hong Kong, when you walk out alone into a city, within minutes from the time you leave your apartment and you're on that very busy street, you have entered a kind of river of anonymity. And that's just a kind of a freedom and a liberation, which I think if you really want to know what that means, talk to somebody famous, a famous face, for example. When they walk out into the street, they're just looked at, and I've found a kind of a similarity between people we think of as famous, and that is they yearn for that anonymity, to be unnoticed, to be able to walk into a river of people and be one among a sea of solitudes, really. But it's a solitude in which you're connected. You're a moving point of light connected to 100 other moving points of light on the street, and there's that connection between you. At the same time, you're completely alone, you're anonymous. Is there a greater pleasure? I can't think of one, actually. No.
Well, I'm sure you can think of a few, but it's among the, it's among the great pleasures for sure. You know, I think in a city you have that, you have the comfort that comes with other people, and maybe this generation, you know, the younger generation in particular, is more or less brought up in a way where you're encouraged never to be on your own. The moment that you step into becoming a consumer, you know, of everything, then that's what you're supposed to do. You're never supposed to spend time with yourself. And I wanted you to get into whether moving towards solitude, you know, starting to approach that as a regular practice, the way you might go into the gym or meditation, might actually be radical on two fronts. It's a little bit of a pushback against you know, the way the markets want you to live your life, buying things and buying more things and watching things and never stopping to reflect or take in any of it. But it's also, in a sense, wonderfully anti-fascist. I mean, I'm sorry this is going long, but I was reading Orwell the other day and going back into, you know, how Winston Smith, he just writes a line down with Big Brother and nobody's seen it or anything. But at that precise moment, he's committed a thought crime. And the essence of that crime is that he stepped away from everybody around him. He stepped away from the comfort of the mob. You see what I mean? So what happens if you turn around and tell everybody out here, just take an hour a day for yourself? And I think we're speaking from a position of relative privilege. You know, if every Indian woman, if every Indian worker took an hour from themselves in the day, we would have a revolution.
A revolution. Yeah. Because I think it's fair to say that especially Indian women who work pretty much from dawn to dusk, providing for all that invisible stuff that goes into making a family, I don't think if you were to ask them if it was something they wanted to do, they would say that they had any choice in the matter. Again, you know, it's something you have to admire, and it's something I think you can learn from. I think when we have, since we're talking about families, when you have, for example, a bereavement in the families, when someone close to you goes away, the only way to deal with that, to make that okay in your head and in your heart, is to be alone. And the thing is, you're not allowed to be alone in moments like that. That's when you get visitors to the house. That's when you have to constantly, every time somebody tells you, I'm so sorry, you end up comforting them. You know, you learn that the great conundrum of grief is that the grief-stricken ends up comforting the people around who are offering their condolences. And that becomes one of the hardest jobs of being in the midst of grief. And the point about grief is, anyone who's been there will tell you, the only way to then recalibrate, to bring yourself back, is to be alone, to spend a month or a few weeks or as many days as you can all by yourself and reflect on the meaning of that relationship, on what you've lost and on what you continue to have. And it's a healing thing, and without it, I think you never actually come to terms with grief. I forget who said it, might have been Naipaul, and he might have been talking about his cat, Augustus, you know, because he was, as someone who disliked humans, he was only ever tender and loving when he talked about his cat. So I think he said that grief is love with nowhere to go, you know. And again, as a writer, this was someone who spent 6 to 9 hours alone in a room. The best possible way to deal with grief, to deal with all those 1,000 cuts in the Shakespearean sense that occur every day, you know, to make those, to heal those cuts. Aloneness. And I don't know what it is about the word loneliness that has a kind of attachment of shame to it these days. You know, it's something, there's something shameful about saying that you are lonely. And there really shouldn't be. That's the natural state. Everything else, family and jobs and colleagues, they're distractions, they're accidents, lucky accidents very often. But you come and you go in one way, and that is alone. You know, you arrive here alone, and you'll eventually leave here alone, no matter how many people love you and no matter how much they love you. It's just the way it is. And I think there's nothing to be ashamed of. You know,
Perhaps it doesn't have as much to do with shame as to do with yearning. You think of solitude as a state of relative completion, you know, a state where you're comfortable in your own company, or you're comfortable looking outwards at whatever surrounds you. And you think of solitude as a state where you don't need very much. Yeah? Loneliness comes with a yearning, and I think maybe the shame comes in when we feel ashamed of having to need, even though that's so human. You know, maybe all you want is somebody to share the fact that you're seeing something beautiful, or that you're restful, or you're, you know, happy where you are. But we're taught to fear it. We're taught to fear it even though it is the most human of conditions, you know. So I think the more that we start to move towards exploring solitude, exploring what it means to live a large part of your life completely alone, even when you're inside relationships or when you're in between relationships, you know, there's a part of the self that you keep entirely to yourself. Do you have a favorite way of being alone? I mean, one always thinks of the writer's room, but sometimes, as you said, it's the streets of a city, it's being alone in the middle of a crowd. Sometimes it's a solitude that might come from being in places like this and, you know, writing by yourself. And do you have favorite ways of being alone for days at a stretch, weeks at a stretch?
We were just talking earlier, Sarnath, Nilanjana and I were talking earlier about being here in Delhi in 2005, when a lot of us kind of arrived here and met each other for the first time. And I remember at that time, I didn't want to work at home because there were too many things going on. And, you know, I remember working in a barista at Khan Market, which was about the size of a closet, really. It's no longer there for some reason, but I remember going there every morning at kind of like a factory job, you know. Every morning I would punch in at about 8:39, and I would be there until lunch, and then I'd go home for lunch, and then I'd come back, and I'd be there till about 5. It was a 9-to-5 job, and it was so. In this tiny table, in this tiny barista, surrounded by noise and people, I was completely alone, and I wrote a book of poems. I wrote These Errors Are Correct, the book that became These Errors Are Correct, which you published.
I did. It was
when you were editing Tranquilbar.
At Tranquilbar, which became Westland Publishing. We were very proud of that book, Jeet.
Well, that was also very beautifully done. So that book was written like kind of, I mean, you know, this goes against all the accepted wisdom, right? You can't write poetry like you're doing a factory job. It has to come, you have to be inspired. Nonsense. You work it like you work a job. And if the inspiration comes, that's just a kind of an added bonus. But you do your writing every day, and strangely, that thing that we call the magic or the inspiration, that will come. And that's the way that book was written, in this really noisy, tiny, loud barista in Delhi, you know, alone on a tiny island of serenity, I think.
And coffee.
And coffee.
There is so much more that I want to ask, but maybe it's a good time to start to...
I think it's time you did
No,
a
no, no, I'm
reading.
fine.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, no, let's hear from you.
Shall we? Okay, fine. I can do a short reading. This was from Black River, and this was actually about my favorite kind of aloneness, which is a together aloneness. You know, where you're free to be in your own private world, but you have a little company alongside. And the two people out here are Chand and Rabia. Chand's been through a time of grieving, a time of powerful grieving. He doesn't really want to talk about it. You know, so often people assume that you want to talk about a loss, a sadness, a sorrow, and you may not really want to use your words that way. But he's on the phone to Rabia. They're at some distance away. And Rabia lives in a colony called Bright Dairy, which is right near Delhi's gigantic trash heap. And Chand lives several villages away. "Do you want to talk?" she says to him. "No." "All right," she says. "That's all right." He doesn't want her to end the call, so he says, "What are you listening to?" "Some old songs on the radio, Naushad, Mukesh, Kishore Kumar. It's a program called Guzre Hue Wo Din. Arshad and Sanama at Aziz Bhai's tonight, so I'm enjoying the pleasure of my own company." Chand says, "I can't hear the music. It's a little muffled. Will you turn the radio up?" "Is this better?" "Yes." "I'll leave it on. You can listen for as long as you like." They spend the evening in each other's company, bridging the distance between his village and her home in Bright Dairy with old familiar songs. Once she forgets that Chand is listening, and he hears Rabia humming along, as she used to do when the three of them, Rabia, Khalid and he, lived together on the banks of the river. When the program ends, he says, "That brought me comfort, Rabia. That music, those tunes, they bring back the old days, a time when my village did not feel the need to separate us into insiders and outsiders." Rabia says, "I call these programs my radio yesterday. But you know, that time is long gone, if it ever truly existed. Bright Dairy has new gates for the first time, separating our side from the Hindu side, and barbed wire fences. They were installed last week. Gates and outsiders," Chand says. "How did all of us live together all those years?" "We lived in the cracks outside the gates," Rabia says. "It was enough for a while." "May I call again tomorrow?" "Please," she says. "I'll find a good program on the radio." "Yes," says Chand. "I like it a lot, your radio yesterday." He can hear her breathing. He nestles his phone closer to his ear, drawing comfort from this lightest of sounds, letting the easy silence stretch between them until finally he says goodbye. His house is quiet, so still, so empty, without the light rise and fall of Rabia's breath. Thanks. Anji.
Lovely, thank you. Brings the whole story back to me. I remember it well. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask whether you want to do a reading or you want to close a little later.
Do you want to open it up
Yeah,
and then?
absolutely. Should
sure.
we?
Yeah.
We'd be so happy to bring all of you in as part of the conversation. There are many questions that I haven't asked, but I have a question from the back. Do you want a mic? One sec.
Thank you.
Oh, you got a mic. Thanks.
Hi. I have a question for each of you. For Miss Roy.
Can't hear you. I think your mic is off.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question for each of you. For Miss Roy first. I remember you had said that the way to be a writer is to live your life like you have no intention of being a writer. And I'm just curious how that fits into the pleasures of solitude and maybe making sure you get time to write. For you, sir, I have a question about, we say
Who's
that...
sir?
It's you, Jeet. It's you. You become respectable.
I always think of the police when I hear the word sir. My name is Jeet.
Okay, Jeet, if that's what you prefer. When we think of writers, we think they're playing God. And God is supposed to be omnipresent, everything, everywhere, all at once. How do you think that really fits in with the picture of a writer sitting alone in a room? Thank you.
Good questions. I have to admit, I was kicking against the whole idea of being writerly, which is precisely in a way what we're doing but not doing, because this turned out to be a genuine conversation, which is kind of playing dress up and, giving gyan. I was really allergic to the giving gyan stage of things for a reason. I'm stepping into writing. It's something that I've done one way or the other all my life from the time I was about 4 or 5, because I was that kind of annoying brat, but I didn't want to go on so much about being a capital W writer. And I think what I wanted to tell people at that point was step out more into life, go break your heart a few times, go discover what it is that you love that nobody else loves, however small or, it's like the different cries of the peacocks at the back. All through this conversation, I've been thinking one of them sounds lonely, but 3 of them sound like they're really happy and they want to join in, and they're being pretty welcoming and together with stuff. Figure out what it is that you love, that you really care about, and don't spend so much time worrying about the writing, because when you're alone, when you're by yourself, it'll come to you if you've done the rest of the living. But the writing isn't going to come out of just wishing, it's going to come out of living or nowhere else.
Actually, when you were asking that question, and you said that Nilanjana once said that you should live your life as if you have no intention of, and then you paused, and my head filled in the words, as if you have no intention of dying.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that too.
Yeah.
That absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a good trick to be a writer. Live as if you have no intention of dying, as if you will live forever, As for the question about God, I think that's exactly what the artist does, right? You create a character, you kill the character off. Who are you if you're not God, if you can kill off characters? That's what God does on a daily basis. You can be sure that the person we think of as God sits alone in a room, coming up with scenarios and coming up with disasters and just causing havoc, and then once in a while sending you a rare moment of illumination. I hesitate to call it peace.
I kind of love this thought that half the world's disasters are basically failed drafts. That's one way to look at it. Question from this side?
Can I?
Yes?
Can I ask you? Okay, I'm Avantika this side. I think a really wonderful session with the way both of you conversed in your own world of being a writer while also engaging with us. My first thing is that you mentioned about being alone and being in the writer's world, maybe, as the writer checked into a hotel but as a writer, you can only write when you engage with the world. At the end of the day, you're connecting with an entire set of audience who's living a real world, and you're part of that society and the world. And your characters are also at one level coming from your lens of seeing your life and others' lives. So how do you engage and disengage in this whole process of writing? And my second point, when Jeet mentioned about God, yes, you do kill characters and bring them in, but God also reincarnates and comes into the world and fights and whatever. So how does a writer reincarnate in his entire journey of writing? Does that happen or that doesn't happen? Thank you. Fun stuff. Let's go for it.
Yeah, good question, because I think every artist, I'm going to kind of not say writer, I'm going to say artist, because I think the one thing that a good artist guards against is repeating himself or herself with every work. And it's just a a kind of a default state. You do have certain obsessions or certain distractions or certain attractions that you can never kind of leave. They're always with you, whatever you might be doing. You kind of come back to those things. But to keep yourself interested and your reader interested, you create a new environment or neighborhood each time. A new system where you put yourself through hoops that you were not expecting to run. And I think that's the way of making it fresh every time. Otherwise, it just gets, it gets kind of stale and it becomes a person talking to themselves, I think.
If you're asking about, that swing back, I do think that you need to be part of the world, but then it's a moot point how much of that world you need to be part of. For Saadat Hasan Manto, he was out there walking the roads, making friends, getting drunk, and that's what he wrote about. But on the other hand, for a score of, I was thinking of Nair Masood, who more or less sat in a room most of his life and churned out these exquisite short stories from somewhere to the left of his skull, For me, I think most of my writing, I came late to writing, and I'm still figuring out who I am or what I'm doing as a writer, and most of my writing happens inevitably in the middle of the muddle. For the longest time, I used to write at the dining table, and you learn to write in the middle of family emergencies or whatever it is. You can't be too precious about it. And I think that's the last thing that I just want to leave out here, which is that none of what we are talking about, whether it's writing or being an artist or being creative in any way, none of that is esoteric. I think every one of us as writers particularly has fought at some level for the right to be alone in order to get the work done. But I genuinely believe that everybody has a creative side to them, whether or not they choose to discover that, whether or not they have they're given the time and the resources to find that out. But I really, really wish that everybody spent a little more time on their own trying to figure out what it is that they wanted to do with their hands, with their love, with their minds. I think we'd be a lot happier that way.
Also, it really helps to not have children. Because once you have children, you're basically done for. I hate to quote this repellent man twice in one
Yeah, there is
sitting.
a lot of Naipaul for one lovely day.
Well,
Jeet.
yeah, but he said, every child you have is a book you do not write. And that's the end of Naipaul for today.
Yeah, thank you. But Naipaul wasn't the one bringing up the children. I'm going to go off on a side rant here about the people who actually bring up children. And come on, a lot of women have had their kids, been productive, etc. But yes, it does save time to not have too many responsibilities, I guess. We have a question.
It's just narcissism, isn't it?
Jeet, down boy.
Mini-me's.
Jeet, yeah. He's trying to start an argument on his own. Hello.
In your case,
You can hear me, right? I just wanted both your thoughts on just moving away from writing and riffing on the engagement piece here about solitude, the eventual silence that it brings, and it comes at quite a struggle, and how it allows you to actively engage with information, people, as opposed to when you're plugged in and you end up being a very passive consumer of everything that is thrown at you. So just, your thoughts on just solitude, silence, and active engagement. I know that sounds very...
No, that's a great point. That's a great point, Jeet. Do you spend much time on screens?
I'm really sorry to say I do. Yeah, I do.
I would not have thought this of you, Jeet. I mean, you've lowered the tone of the... But
I hate
how do you do
myself when I do it, but I do, yeah. Watching the most abject kind of waste of time type content, I really like to watch trash TV, anything that turns the brain off for me is just kind of very relaxing. I recommend 90 Day Fiancé. Is that what it's called?
You know, that sounds almost as bad as the Bengali hit classic Obhishapto Nighty, or the saga of the cursed nighty. Yeah, so we've both done a fair amount of time wasting. Twitter was my kryptonite. But even with that, you know, the only time when I'm actually writing, then the screens go off. That's the only way that I can handle it. And it's a paradox. I think we spend a lot of time waiting for blocks of time to be free. And then back in the old days, it used to be Tetris or Pac-Man or Wolfenstein that we were wasting our time on. And technology makes it easy. Then at some point you realize that it's basically like nicotine. You know, you're paying a company to kill yourself. And that doesn't make much sense. So you do bring in a little bit in the way of freedom and sense. At some point I realized that I'd written a novel on Twitter over 4 years, because the tweets added up to more than 110,000 words. And that was my, okay, wait a minute, you know, what exactly am I feeding out here? Because I'm certainly not feeding my immortal soul. You know, I would love to say that that was the moment that I unplugged completely, but life is not a fairy tale. And I'm still on Twitter, but much less, I promise, than I used to be. And honestly, at some point, I think the more that you discover that you have a better time off social media than on, the more that you're free to do stuff that really engages you and engages your mind.
There was that moment about 10 years ago when every other book would carry, in the acknowledgements page, it would carry a very grateful thank you to one of those apps that prevent you from getting online. Yeah. I would like to thank self-control. You know? You saw that a lot at one point.
Do we have more questions? Anyone else want to jump in? Okay. In that case, we're going to close out with a reading from Jeet.
This is a poem from I'll Have It Here. It's about driving with a ghost in the car, kind of driving, and it's driving in Delhi. It's called Real-Time Crash Investigation. Like the TV series? Yep. Yeah, Real-Time Airplane Investigations. It's called Real-Time Crash Investigation. Tonight's the night for a cheap red churn. 3 hours to All Fool's Day, not a second to burn. Cheap is cheap as cheap should be. Red is red because, hey, that's me. I'm drinking from the bottle. It's dark, no one can see. One more, then I floor it. 70 miles and we're free. You don't talk much, but you are good company. Stop signs are the enemy. I'm fine with a fine. Bad Sula wine is a balm to the mind. When we hit Haryana, I'll stop for a pee. Take a deep breath and water a tree. Swallow the taste of chemicals, empty my spleen, tinkle sulfite poison on the Sea of Galilee. I want to forgive you, but this, it's begrudgery. I'm sorry, so sorry, you're dead and I'm not. If I could, I'd excise the boil on my bodbot. But I can't, so instead, consider this an apology. Forever and ever will I be your bee. Behind me is brunch, ahead is high tea. Remember when lunch was an opportunity? Maybe it's time to dissolve this LLC. Let me be. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeet. And thank you, ghosts and peacocks, and everyone else who showed up.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Nilanjana.
Thank you both for a truly mesmerizing conversation. And there are books by Nilanjana, by Jeet. You can buy them. They're happy to sign them.